February 1258. A man stands in his own treasury surrounded by more gold than he can count. Guards stand on either side of him, but they are not there to protect him. This gold was supposed to buy safety. For 50 years, it paid for silks, scholars, and a lifestyle of absolute luxury. But while the vaults were being filled, the city's defenses were left to rot. Now, the men standing beside him are watching his face, waiting for the moment he finally realizes that his wealth is worthless. Behind him, Baghdad is burning. Ahead of him, something much worse than fire is waiting. This is Caliph Al-Mustasim, the ruler of the most powerful city on earth and the spiritual heir to the Prophet Muhammad. In 3 hours, he will be dead. He won't die by a sword or an arrow. Instead, he will die in a way so brutal and so calculated that it served as a message to every king from Damascus to Delhi. The Mongols didn't just want to kill him. They wanted to turn his execution into a blueprint for terror. They didn't need to do it twice. They only needed to do it once. For 500 years, Baghdad was the axis, not just of an empire, but of thought itself. This was the city where Greek philosophy met Persian astronomy, where Indian mathematics merged with Islamic law, and where the world's knowledge concentrated into libraries that cataloged everything from medicine to mechanics. The House of Wisdom alone held texts that would take you 3 lifetimes to read. Imagine a place where the air smelled of vellum and ink, where translated works of Aristotle sat next to fresh discoveries in optics and surgery. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra here, and Al-Razi wrote medical encyclopedias that Europe would translate 400 years later. Scholars traveled from Spain to Samarkand just to study in Baghdad's academies. The city's population exceeded 1 million. Its infrastructure channeled water through underground canals. Its markets traded goods from China to Cordoba, and its hospitals treated patients regardless of faith or wealth. This wasn't Rome fading into memory. This was a civilization at its operational peak. The Grand Vizier once remarked that to leave Baghdad was to leave the sun for the shadows. But the sun was setting. But beneath the surface of this golden age was a fragile reality. The city's wealth had created a sense of invincibility that was entirely detached from the shifting world outside its walls. While the poets wrote and the merchants traded, a new kind of power was rising in the east. A power that did not care for philosophy or fine silk. The Mongols viewed the world as a hunt, and Baghdad was the ultimate prize. And ruling over all of it was the Caliph. Not just a king or a political figure, the Caliph was the successor to Muhammad and the spiritual authority over millions of Muslims, with a legitimacy stretching back through 37 generations. Al-Mustasim inherited that title in 1242, but he also inherited a government that had been decaying for 2 centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate still spoke with religious authority, but its armies were mostly mercenaries, its governors were semi-independent warlords, and its treasury was filled but never spent on defense. The Caliph believed that his title alone was a shield, that the commander of the faithful was protected by a divine contract that no earthly army could break. Because Baghdad had survived internal weakness before, it assumed it always would. It had endured civil wars, outlasted rival caliphs, and watched empires rise and collapse around it, while its scholars kept writing and its markets kept trading. So, when distant reports arrived about horsemen in the east, horsemen who had already erased the Khwarezmian Empire, depopulated cities in Persia, and refused to stop at rivers or negotiated borders, Baghdad took note and did nothing. The Mongols were not an army. They were a mechanism, a system refined over 50 years of constant warfare across terrain that spanned from frozen steppes to deserts. They were the first truly modern military in history, utilizing a decimal structure where units were divided into groups of 10, 100, and 1,000. This allowed for flawless communication and terrifying speed. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind a military doctrine that turned warfare into a replicable process. In 1253, his grandson Hulagu Khan was tasked with a specific objective: secure submission from every state between Mongolia and the Mediterranean. Not just military defeat, but submission. Hulagu's force was a coalition of the conquered. He brought thousands of Chinese engineers who specialized in gunpowder and siege engines, and Persian bureaucrats who knew how to manage the logistics of a 150,000-man army. They utilized Taman units, specialized divisions of 10,000 riders that could operate independently but strike simultaneously. Because the Mongol Empire wasn't built on occupation, it was built on compliance. Cities that submitted early retained their autonomy, and their leaders stayed in power so long as they paid tribute and acknowledged Mongol supremacy. Cities that resisted simply stopped existing. Every target received the same sequence. Mongol messengers arrive and present terms in writing, submit immediately, send tribute, provide hostages, and accept Mongol governance. Compliance means survival. Your walls stay standing and your population lives. Refusal triggers nothing immediate. No threats, no ultimatums, just silence. Weeks pass, sometimes months, and the city continues its routine. Defenders begin to think the Mongols were bluffing or moved on to easier targets. They go back to their markets and their prayers, convincing themselves that the danger has passed. And then, as if emerging from the earth itself, the horizon fills with horsemen moving in coordinated patterns. This was the psychological siege. The moment the victims realized they weren't dealing with men, but with a hayr, relentless tide. Siege engines arrive on wagons, and the army surrounds every gate and escape route. Then construction begins. In full view of the defenders, the Mongols assemble trebuchets designed to throw 300-pound stones. They didn't just build these machines. They built them with a terrifying lack of emotion. Engineers from China and Persia work alongside Mongol soldiers, while the defenders watch machines being built specifically to dismantle their walls. A second embassy arrives, repeating the terms word for word. This is the last chance. Most cities surrender here. If refusal continues, the siege begins as a procedure. When walls collapse, infantry moves through in units, and when gates break, cavalry secures routes. Once inside, the population is divided. Artisans, scholars, and engineers are spared, but everyone else is gathered in fields outside the city. The Mongols were efficient. They didn't waste resources on those who could not serve the empire. What happened next was not random violence. It was systematic elimination. The survivors were resettled, and the city itself was often burned as evidence. The Mongols didn't conquer for territory, they conquered for compliance, and every ruined city became a textbook for the next one. This was the Yasa, the Mongol code of law, brought to life through blood. By 1257, Hulagu had applied this system across Persia. Nishapur, Merv, and Herat all refused and were reduced to ruins. In Merv, it was said that every Mongol soldier was ordered to execute 400 people personally. This was arithmetic applied to mass death. Now, Hulagu turned toward the greatest city between Persia and Egypt, Baghdad. In September 1257, Hulagu sent 3 riders carrying a single letter. You have heard what has befallen the cities of Persia. You know the cost of refusal. Submit to the great Khan, dismantle your fortifications, and send your sons as hostages. Do this, and your city will be spared. Refuse, and you will learn what the others learned. The letter arrived on a Thursday, and by Friday, the debate had begun. His vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, urged immediate compliance, citing the 400,000 soldiers of the Khwarezmian Empire who were already gone. He stood before the caliph, pointing at maps of destroyed nations. "These are not raiders," he pleaded. "This is a military system we cannot fight. We can only survive them. If we fight, we lose everything: our children, our history, our very names." The head of the army disagreed, arguing that the Mongols had no experience with siege warfare against prepared defenses. He called the vizier a coward and promised the caliph that the walls of Baghdad, which had stood for centuries, would be the Mongols' graveyard. Meanwhile, religious scholars argued that God would not allow pagans to destroy the house of the Prophet's lineage. Al-Mustasim, fond of luxury and uncomfortable with military matters, looked at his advisors and made his choice. "We are the Caliphate," he declared. "We do not submit to threats from horsemen. The heavens themselves defend these walls. If they come, the earth will swallow them." He dismissed the envoys and made no preparations. He didn't even call for the full mobilization of the surrounding provinces. Ibn al-Alqami tried one more time, warning that they would come, but al-Mustasim simply replied, "Then let them come." The envoys left on September 24th, and the caliph continued his routine as if the threat would dissolve through inaction. He spent his days in the gardens, perhaps convinced that the Mongols were just another passing storm. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, Hulagu's army began moving with the precision of a clockwork machine. By November, Mongol advance forces appeared 30 miles east of Baghdad. The military commander saw an opportunity to destroy a small, isolated force, and the caliph agreed. On November 13th, Baghdad's field army of 20,000 men marched out. The armies met on November 15th. The Mongol force appeared smaller than expected, and Baghdad's cavalry charged. This was the feigned retreat, a classic Mongol tactic. The Mongol line retreated in coordination, drawing the cavalry miles away from their support. Then, hidden flanks emerged from the dust. Baghdad's cavalry was surrounded by 15,000 horsemen. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a dismantling. Mongol cavalry archers used composite bows to punch through armor from 200 yards away. They didn't even need to engage in hand-to-hand combat. They just rode in circles, raining death until the field was covered in bodies. By nightfall, fewer than 3,000 men returned. Baghdad's field army had been erased. This was a trap. By December, the main Mongol force was on the horizon. On January 11, 1258, Hulagu's 150,000 soldiers completed the encirclement. They built fortified camps and supply lines, making escape impossible. Inside the city, the mood shifted from arrogance to a hollow, biting terror. Food prices skyrocketed. A single loaf of bread cost more than a silk robe. The screams of the wounded in the streets became the soundtrack of the city. Trebuchets were built in full view of the defenders, and on January 17th, Hulagu sent one final message. The time for full submission has passed, but the caliph may still preserve his life. Open the gates within 3 days, and the population will be spared. The caliph hesitated, caught between his pride and the reality of the iron ring around his neck. No response was sent. On January 29th, the trebuchets began firing. Engineers had calculated every weak point, and the bombardment continued until the eastern wall began to crumble. This was not the random stone throwing of older wars. This was structural demolition. They used naphtha-infused projectiles that turned the air into fire. By February 5th, a 90-foot section disintegrated. Mongol infantry moved in, and by nightfall, they controlled the eastern quarter. On February 10th, the Caliph finally sent word, "I will surrender personally. Spare the city." On February 13th, 1258, the Caliph walked out of Baghdad with 3,000 members of his court. They walked through the Mongol camp in silence until Hulagu received him in his command tent. Hulagu's first question was practical. "Where is your treasury?" The Caliph hesitated. "We are prepared to offer tribute." "Where is it?" Hulagu repeated, his voice like a winter wind. The Caliph provided directions, and hours later, the vault was opened. They found thousands of gold ingots and jewels accumulated over generations. Hulagu walked the Caliph through his own smoldering treasury and asked the silent question, "Why was this wealth sitting here while your walls crumbled? Why was this gold locked away while your city prepared for nothing?" Controversial segment: the gold consumption. The historian Rashid al-Din records that Hulagu looked at the mountain of gold and then at the starving Caliph. He ordered a plate of gold nuggets to be placed before Al-Mustasim. "Eat," Hulagu commanded, his eyes burning with a cold, mocking fury. "I cannot eat gold," the Caliph whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at the metal that was worth more than his soul. "Then why did you keep it?" Hulagu roared, the sound echoing off the vault walls. "Why did you not send it to me as tribute to save your people? Why did you not melt it into iron to forge gates for your city? You loved this gold more than your life. So now, let it be your feast." The Caliph was forced to confront the absolute worthlessness of his hoarded wealth. It was a psychological execution before the physical one. Because the Mongols believed royal blood must not touch the ground, they chose a specific execution method. The Caliph was wrapped in a heavy carpet, his arms and legs immobilized. He was a parcel of flesh and history, laid onto the dirt, a parcel of history waiting for the end. Controversial segment: the nature of the execution. "Do it," came the command. Horses were led slowly and deliberately across the wrapped figure. The weight of the war horses crushed the body inside the carpet, and though the screams were muffled, the sound of breaking bone was clear. This was not a quick death. It was a slow, agonizing weight that squeezed the life out of him. Imagine the weight of an empire pressing down on a single man. No blood touched the earth. The taboo was satisfied. But a message had been sent to every court from Anatolia to Delhi. The Caliph's sons were executed the same day. His daughters were taken and disappeared from the records. The 3,000 ministers and scholars who walked out with him were divided. Those with skills were spared, and the rest were executed. The Abbasid dynasty, after 500 years of rule, was severed. The line that connected back to the Prophet was cut with the efficiency of a butcher's knife. For 13 days, the Mongol army dismantled Baghdad. Skills were saved, valuables were catalogued, and everyone else was moved outside the walls. The House of Wisdom burned, and so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river reportedly ran black with ink. It was said that a horse could walk across the river on the piles of books alone. The destruction was deliberate, ensuring Baghdad could not quickly recover. It wasn't just about killing people. It was about killing the memory of who they were. The loss of these texts set the scientific world back by centuries. Hulagu withdrew on February 20th, leaving behind a city reduced by half. He wanted the survivors to tell the story. He wanted them to describe the smell of the smoke and the sound of the carpets. Within a year, every court knew what happened to the man who thought he was untouchable. Cities like Damascus and Aleppo opened their gates or sent tribute preemptively. They had performed the calculation: resist and watch your family be erased, or submit and survive. The Mongol expansion finally stopped in 1260 at the Battle of Ain Jalut, but even the Mamluks had learned from Baghdad. They realized the Mongols weren't raiders you could wait out. They were a system you had to match. They became a military state, born from the terror that Baghdad had failed to stop. They turned their children into soldiers and their society into a fortress. Baghdad survived, but it never recovered its position as the center of civilization. The House of Wisdom was never rebuilt, and the scholars were never replaced. The city that was once the axis of the world became a provincial outpost. What persisted was the memory of what defiance cost. The trauma stayed in the DNA of the region for generations. Titles, tradition, and sacred authority do not stop siege engines. When systems collide, the one that adapts survives, and the one that doesn't becomes a case study that echoes for centuries. The Mongols proved that faith without preparedness is merely a slow suicide. The Mongols didn't just destroy a city. They sent a warning written in smoke and stone. They proved that history has no favorites, and that even the most sacred titles can be crushed under the hooves of a horse. They didn't just end a dynasty, they ended an age of certainty. And some warnings, once taught, never need repeating. This is Crimson Historians, where history is not softened for comfort. Subscribe if you want the pattern behind the events. Not just what happened, but why it kept happening. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.